The Egyptian desert is brutal, scorching heat, endless sand, and not a drop of water in sight. Yet ancient Egyptians found ways to survive for days without fresh water. From extracting water from camel stomachs to attending special schools that trained them for the desert. Here are 15 ways Egyptians travelled for days without water. Camel stomach water extraction. The Egyptian desert was merciless. No rivers, no wells, and the blazing sun above. Therefore, if a traveller ran out of water, their survival chances plummeted. But when there was no other choice, desperate Egyptians turned to one of the most shocking survival methods imaginable: extracting water from a camel's stomach. Yes, you heard that right. While this wasn't a common practice, it was a known last resort technique for those stranded with no way to find fresh water. Camels are famous for surviving days, sometimes weeks, without drinking. But contrary to popular belief, they don't store water in their humps. Instead, their bloodstream and stomach hold moisture that allows them to endure extreme heat. In an emergency, Egyptian travellers who had exhausted all other options could cut open a camel's stomach to access the partially digested water inside. This wasn't clean or fresh, it was mixed with food and digestive fluids. But in the desert, it could mean the difference between life and death. Egyptians travelling through the Western Desert and Sinai Peninsula sometimes resorted to this if a camel collapsed from exhaustion. But killing a camel wasn't a decision taken lightly. These animals were extremely valuable. They weren't just a mode of transport, they were a source of milk, meat, leather, and even fuel from dried dung. That meant this method was used only in extreme desperation when no other water source was available. Some reports suggest that travellers would filter the liquid through cloth to remove the worst impurities, making it slightly safer to drink. Others would boil the extracted liquid over a fire if they had the means, reducing harmful bacteria. However, these steps weren't always possible in life or death situations. The Egyptians weren't the only ones who knew about this technique. Bedouin tribes, African nomads, and even some ancient armies relied on camels in extreme survival situations. Some historians speculate that Pharaoh Seti IV's military expeditions may have depended on camels' endurance, with stomach water extraction as a last resort. There are also historical records suggesting that some desert travellers would surgically extract fluid from a living camel's stomach without killing it, keeping it alive for further use. However, this method required skill and was rarely performed. This wasn't a preferred method, but in a land where every drop of water mattered, even the most unthinkable options had to be considered. Drinking blood from livestock. Extreme survival method. When the Egyptian desert pushed travellers to their limits, they had to find creative ways to maintain hydration and energy levels. In the most desperate situations, Egyptians had a shocking but effective trick: drinking blood from their livestock. Unlike extracting water from a camel's stomach, this wasn't about replacing water, it was about surviving longer without it. Livestock, like goats, cattle, and even sheep, weren't just used for transport and food, they were also a source of emergency nutrition. Egyptian traders, nomads, and even military forces knew that when water was low, draining small amounts of blood could help preserve strength and prevent dehydration-related weakness. Rather than killing the animal, Egyptians would make a small incision in a vein, usually in the neck or leg, and drain limited amounts of blood into a container. Unlike water, blood contains electrolytes, iron and protein, which help prevent fatigue, muscle cramps and dizziness in extreme heat. Some desert travellers even mixed the blood with milk to make it more palatable and easier to digest, similar to the practice still found in some East African cultures today. Others boiled it or cooked it to prevent illness. Egyptian military forces used this method strategically during long desert campaigns. Historical accounts suggest that Pharaoh Thutmose III's armies, which marched deep into Canaan and Libya, relied on their livestock's blood and milk to stay strong when water was scarce. Egyptian traders and herders travelling in caravans through the Western Desert also drank blood at night, before rest periods, since consuming it during extreme heat could cause nausea or dizziness. Some historians also believe that certain desert nomadic groups in ancient North Africa developed methods to extract blood without harming the animal's long-term health, ensuring they could repeat the process throughout their journey. Since fresh blood coagulates quickly, Egyptians used clay containers or leather pouches to keep it liquid. Some even dried and preserved it for later use, grinding it into a powder-like substance to mix with other food. Even with this method, Egyptians knew nothing replaced fresh water. They always prioritized reaching wells, oases, or underground water reserves as soon as possible. Lightweight water storage with leather water skins. Egyptian messengers and desert scouts depended on leather water skins for survival. Some historical accounts suggest that traders heading from Memphis to the Red Sea ports carried multiple skins, refilling them at oases or hidden desert wells along the way. Without these portable containers, crossing vast stretches of land would have been nearly impossible. The leather acted as a natural insulator, keeping the water cooler for longer periods. Egyptians often tied water skins to their animals in shaded areas or covered them with wet cloth to take advantage of evaporative cooling. To seal the skins, they used wooden stoppers, rope ties or wax, ensuring the water remained fresh for days. This was especially useful for those travelling through the western desert trade routes, where the heat was relentless. Carrying large clay jars filled with water was practical for long journeys, but they were heavy and fragile. That's where leather water skins came in. These flexible, lightweight containers were a game changer for desert travellers, merchants and messengers in ancient Egypt. Unlike clay, leather wouldn't shatter if dropped, making it much more reliable for long treks. Water skins were typically made from goat or cowhide, which was carefully cleaned, sewn together, and treated with natural oils or animal fat to make it waterproof. The leather formed a tight seal, preventing leaks and reducing evaporation. Unlike stiff clay jars, water skins could be squeezed and adjusted, making them easier to carry and store. Travellers could strap them to donkeys, oxen, or their own backs, ensuring they had quick access to water without needing to stop and unpack heavy loads. Larger water skins were used for caravans and military expeditions, where a single skin might hold gallons of water. These massive skins, carried by donkeys or oxen, ensured that soldiers and merchants had enough supply for days. Even with these innovations, water was still a limited resource, and Egyptians had to be smart about rationing and conserving every drop. Clay jars and sealed amphorae. Water in the desert wasn't just a necessity, it was survival, and the ancient Egyptians knew exactly how to store and transport it. Their secret? Clay jars and sealed amphorae. Amphorae were tall, narrow-necked clay vessels designed to keep water cool even under the scorching sun. Egyptians mastered pottery as early as 3000 BCE, and by the time of the New Kingdom, 1550 to 1070 BCE, they had perfected the art of storing liquids for long journeys. These jars weren't just sitting in homes, they were carried by traders, military expeditions, and desert travellers who needed fresh water to last for days. But how did they work? The trick was in the porous nature of clay. Unlike metal or glass, unglazed clay allows slow evaporation, which naturally cools the water inside. Think of it like an ancient air conditioning system. But for water, Egyptians would often partially bury these jars in the sand to keep them even cooler. Some were even placed in woven reed baskets for extra insulation. Some amphorae weren't just sealed with simple lids. They were covered with resin or beeswax to prevent evaporation and contamination. This method was so effective that similar jar sealing techniques were still being used in Egyptian households thousands of years later. Traders sailing along the Nile River from Elephantine to the bustling ports of Alexandria relied on these clay vessels to keep their water supply fresh. Even soldiers during Pharaoh Thutmose III's military campaigns carried amphorae filled with water, wine and beer, ensuring hydration in the brutal heat of battle. And they didn't stop there. Egyptians also designed smaller personal water jars that were carried on donkeys or strapped to their backs. Some were wrapped in damp cloth to enhance cooling through evaporation. Without these jars, long-distance travel in Egypt's arid climate would have been nearly impossible. But of course, carrying water was only part of the challenge. Next came the problem of making it last. Animal transport. Carrying enough water for a long desert journey wasn't easy, especially when travelling through Egypt's unforgiving terrain. That's why ancient Egyptians relied on animals like camels, donkeys and oxen to transport heavy loads of water, making long-distance travel possible. But wait, weren't camels the ultimate desert survival animal? Not quite. While camels are known today as the ships of the desert, they weren't widely used in Egypt until around 500 BCE, when Persian influence introduced them to the region. Before that, Egyptians mainly depended on donkeys and oxen for carrying water across great distances. Ancient Egyptian military expeditions relied heavily on donkeys to transport water. Inscriptions from Pharaoh Hatshepsut's reign, 1479 to 1458 BCE, show that entire convoys of donkeys were used to haul water for soldiers as they marched into Nubia. Without these animals, large-scale desert warfare would have been nearly impossible. Donkeys were smaller and more agile, making them ideal for transporting water through mountainous and rocky paths near cities like Thebes and Abydos. Traders and messengers often loaded them with large clay jars or leather water skins, ensuring they had enough to last for days. Oxen, on the other hand, were stronger and sturdier, making them perfect for pulling heavy carts filled with massive water containers across the western desert. When camels finally became common, their ability to store water in their bodies made them a game changer for long-distance travel. Unlike donkeys and oxen, camels could go for days without drinking, making them perfect for the most extreme desert routes, like those leading to the Siwa Oasis or Nubian trade route. Whether it was traders, soldiers or merchants, animals played a crucial role in transporting Egypt's most valuable resource. But even with heavy loads, conservation was key, and Egyptians had other tricks to make their supply last even longer. Underground water storage in travel stations. The Egyptian desert was vast, dry and unforgiving. Travelers needed reliable water sources, and carrying enough for long journeys wasn't always possible. That's why ancient Egyptians developed underground water storage stations, a smart system of hidden reservoirs that allowed caravans and traders to refill along their routes without hauling excessive supplies from the start. These storage pits were lined with stone or clay to prevent seepage and were placed at strategic locations along major trade paths. Some were dug near rock formations to keep them shaded, while others were built into the ground near existing wells or dried riverbeds to collect rainwater when available. To prevent evaporation in the scorching heat, Egyptians covered the reservoirs with wooden lids, sand or even layers of palm fronds. Some temple records and inscriptions suggest that pharaohs and wealthy merchants funded the construction of these reservoirs to support trade. There are even accounts of desert guides and nomadic tribes maintaining and guarding these stations in exchange for goods or payment from passing caravans. Without this system, crossing vast desert regions like the Western Desert or the Sinai Peninsula would have been nearly impossible. These water stations weren't just for survival, they were part of Egypt's sophisticated trade infrastructure. Long-distance traders, especially those travelling from Memphis to Nubia or along the Darb el Arbain trade route, relied on these hidden reserves to keep their caravans moving. Since Egypt was a major trade hub connecting Africa, the Middle East and the Mediterranean, these stations helped facilitate commerce while ensuring travellers didn't succumb to dehydration. Egyptians also dug deep underground storage wells to collect and filter groundwater, creating reliable drinking sources that could last for months. Even with these hidden reserves, travellers still had to carefully ration and plan their route, making every drop count on their journey across the scorching desert. Desert wells and oases. Even in the harshest deserts, the Egyptians knew that water was always somewhere beneath the surface. Instead of carrying massive amounts of water, travellers relied on wells and oases, natural water sources scattered across the arid landscape. Knowing their locations was a skill passed down through generations, making the difference between life and death on long journeys. Egyptians developed detailed maps and oral traditions to track the locations of desert wells and oases, ensuring safe passage through Egypt's vast landscapes. Some wells were artificially dug, lined with stone to prevent collapse, and maintained by desert dwellers or temple workers. Others were natural underground springs, where water naturally surfaced due to pressure beneath the ground. The most famous oasis, Siwa, was a critical water stop for travellers heading toward Libya. Caravans moving along the Darb el Arbain, the 40 Days Road, an ancient trade route connecting Nubia and Egypt, depended on hidden wells spaced at strategic intervals. These wells allowed traders to move goods like gold, ivory and spices across extreme desert conditions. Egyptian desert scouts and nomadic tribes were often hired to guide travelers to these water sources. Some tribes kept their well locations secret, only sharing them with trusted allies or in exchange for trade goods. Historical records suggest that pharaohs sent expeditions to expand water access, ensuring safe trade and military movement. The famous Ain Musa, Moses Spring, near the Sinai Peninsula, was one such well, providing fresh water for travelers heading between Egypt and Canaan. Even military campaigns, such as those led by Pharaoh Thutmose III, depended on finding and controlling key water sources to maintain strength in battle. While wells and oases made survival possible, they weren't always nearby. That's why Egyptians combined this knowledge with other water conservation techniques, ensuring they could go days without a fresh supply if needed, following birds and insects to find hidden water sources. Ancient Egyptians understood that certain animals, especially birds and insects, had an instinct for locating water. By carefully observing their behaviour, travellers could track down hidden wells, underground springs and oases, giving them a much-needed chance at survival. Birds, particularly doves and swallows, rarely strayed far from water sources. Egyptians knew that flocks flying in a straight direction at sunrise or sunset were likely headed to or from a watering hole or oasis. Traders and soldiers travelling between Thebes, Elephantine and the Western Desert relied on these natural guides, adjusting their routes based on bird movements. Insects were another clue. Bees and ants were indicators of nearby water since they needed moisture to survive. Egyptians often spotted lines of ants moving in and out of small cracks in the ground, a sign that underground water might be close. Desert flies were another giveaway. They never wandered far from damp areas. Egyptian desert scouts and nomadic guides were trained to recognize tracks left by animals like gazelles and ibex, which tended to frequent watering holes. Some hunters would even wait near these spots, knowing that thirsty animals would eventually lead them to a freshwater source. Historians believe that Egyptian military expeditions, like those led by Pharaoh Seti I, used these tracking techniques to sustain their armies in remote regions. Long-distance caravans heading toward Nubia and the Sinai Peninsula also depended on this method, as their survival often depended on finding water along the way. While tracking animals wasn't always a guaranteed way to find water, it significantly increased the chances of survival. Combined with other techniques, Egyptians could extend their journeys without carrying excessive water, extracting moisture from plants. Water wasn't always found in wells or carried in jars. Sometimes it had to be pulled directly from nature. Some desert plants, like date palms, fig trees and reeds, store moisture in their roots, leaves or fruit. Egyptians travelling through oases and riverbanks could collect this water-rich vegetation and press the liquid out. Palm trees in particular were valuable. Not only did they provide shade, but their trunks could also be cut to release stored moisture, which could be collected and drunk in emergencies. Other plants, like aloe vera, held water in their thick, fleshy leaves. Egyptian travellers sometimes sliced open these plants to access the hydrating gel inside. Though not as refreshing as clear water, the moisture helped prevent dehydration. Egyptians also tracked desert shrubs and vines that collected morning dew. Some traders and desert scouts would wrap cloth around plants overnight, allowing the fabric to soak up condensation. In the morning, they would wring out the cloth, collecting small but crucial amounts of water to drink. While this wasn't a method that could sustain large groups, it was a critical survival trick for individuals or small parties travelling through the desert. With every drop of water being precious, Egyptians understood that knowing how to extract moisture from plants could mean the difference between life and death, drinking in small sips. In the blistering heat of the Egyptian desert, drinking water seemed like the obvious solution to survival. But here's the trick. Drinking too much, too fast, could be just as dangerous as running out. Ancient Egyptians understood that water had to last, and one of the simplest yet most effective methods was drinking in small sips rather than gulping it down all at once. When someone drinks too much water quickly, their body processes it faster, leading to more sweating and faster dehydration. The Egyptians figured out that taking small sips at regular intervals kept the body hydrated for longer periods. This technique was especially important for traders, soldiers and desert travellers who couldn't afford to run out of water too soon. Historians believe that Egyptian military leaders trained their soldiers to ration their water intake during campaigns. Pharaoh Ramses II's army, which marched deep into Canaan and Nubia, had to make their supplies last in extreme desert conditions. Some Egyptian traders travelling from Abydos to the Red Sea ports also followed this practice, ensuring they had enough water for their long journey. Ancient texts and temple carvings suggest that Egyptian desert scouts and messengers were taught strict water discipline. Some even chewed on date pits or small twigs to keep their mouths moist, reducing their urge to drink too much at once. Beyond rationing, Egyptians understood that drinking lukewarm water instead of ice-cold water helped prevent shock to the body, especially in extreme heat. They also avoided drinking large amounts right before long treks, as it could lead to excessive sweating and a faster loss of hydration. Even with well-planned rationing, travellers had to be careful with every sip. Making water last was just as important as finding it. Using salt for hydration balance. Drinking water alone wasn't always enough to survive in the Egyptian desert. The intense heat caused excessive sweating, which led to the loss of essential minerals like sodium and potassium, key electrolytes that kept the body functioning properly. Ancient Egyptians understood that maintaining a balance of water and salt was just as important as staying hydrated. When people sweat, they don't just lose water, they also lose vital salts that help regulate body temperature and prevent muscle cramps. To counteract this, Egyptians travelling through harsh desert regions like the Western Desert or the Sinai Peninsula would consume small amounts of salt to retain hydration and keep their bodies from becoming weak or fatigued. One common method was eating salted foods before a journey, such as dried fish or preserved meat, which helped the body retain water for longer. Traders and soldiers often carried salted bread or fermented dairy products, ensuring they didn't lose electrolytes too quickly. Some historians believe Egyptian labourers working under the sun on massive construction projects, like the pyramid, were given salt-rich foods and drinks to prevent dehydration and exhaustion. Egyptians also recognised the value of natron, a natural salt mixture harvested from dry lake beds. While mostly used for cleaning and embalming, it was sometimes dissolved in water to replenish lost minerals. Some records suggest that Egyptian doctors prescribed salt solutions to travellers and soldiers returning from long expeditions. Military campaigns, such as those led by Pharaoh Thutmose III, required careful rationing of both water and salt, as losing too much of either could weaken an army before battle. Some Nubian traders travelling between Thebes and Elephantine also followed this practice, consuming salted foods to help their bodies retain moisture. While too much salt could be harmful, the Egyptians knew that small, controlled amounts played a crucial role in desert survival. Without electrolyte balance, even access to water wouldn't be enough to keep travellers alive in extreme conditions. Minimal talking to reduce water loss. Egyptian desert messengers and scouts were trained to conserve energy by limiting speech, walking at a controlled pace, and breathing only through their noses. Some even chewed on small pieces of wood or cloth to keep their mouths moist and reduce the urge to talk. Surviving in the Egyptian desert wasn't just about how much water you had, it was about how little you wasted. One simple yet effective survival strategy used by traders, soldiers and nomads was minimizing speech during long journeys, because every word spoken expelled moisture from the body, speeding up dehydration. Hieroglyphic records from temple walls suggest that Pharaoh Ramses II's soldiers used minimal talking rules when travelling to distant battle campaigns. Even camel drivers leading trade caravans encouraged quiet travel, ensuring their water supplies lasted as long as possible. Breathing through the mouth while talking increases moisture loss, especially in hot, dry climate. Egyptians understood that limiting conversation, breathing through the nose, and only speaking when absolutely necessary could help conserve hydration. Caravans crossing the Western Desert or the Sinai Peninsula often had silent travel periods, especially during peak heat hours, to reduce unnecessary moisture loss. This practice was particularly important for Egyptian military units marching through the desert. Commanders issued orders in short, direct statements, and soldiers were trained to communicate through hand signals when possible. Traders travelling between Memphis and the Red Sea ports also followed this rule, knowing that talking too much could cost them precious water before reaching the next oasis. In a desert where every drop of moisture mattered, even something as simple as silence could mean survival. Speaking less wasn't just about saving energy, it was a strategic way to ensure that travellers could stretch their limited water supply for as long as possible. Shade and resting. During peak heat, the Egyptian desert wasn't just hot, it was deadly. With temperatures soaring above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, 38 degrees Celsius, during midday, sweating too much could mean losing precious water faster than it could be replaced. That's why one of the smartest survival tactics ancient Egyptians used was resting in the shade during peak heat, and only travelling when temperatures were lower. Moving under the scorching sun forced the body to sweat excessively, leading to rapid dehydration. Instead, Egyptians timed their journeys carefully, travelling in the early morning or late afternoon, when the sun wasn't as intense. Some even travelled at night, using moonlight and the stars to guide them. Caravans, military units and traders on long journeys would set up shaded rest stops, often near rock formations, trees or tents made of woven palm fronds. In larger trade hubs like Ombos and Elephantine, travellers could stop at way stations built specifically for sheltering from the heat. Some Egyptian labourers and travellers carried lightweight linen canopies that could be propped up with wooden poles to create instant shade. They also wore loose, white linen clothing, which reflected the sun's heat while allowing air circulation to keep the body cool. Historical records show that Pharaoh Seti I's soldiers used this technique while marching into Canaan and Libya. Egyptian military planners understood that moving troops during the hottest hours would lead to fatigue, dehydration, and slower progress. Traders heading from Thebes to the Red Sea also scheduled rest periods at known shaded spots along their routes to ensure they didn't overexert themselves. Even with water supplies, survival in the desert wasn't just about drinking. It was about conserving every drop. That's why staying in the shade wasn't just comfort. It was a matter of life and death. Wrapping the head and body to reduce dehydration. When people think of desert survival, they often assume less clothing is better. But the ancient Egyptians knew the truth. Wearing the right clothing could mean the difference between life and death. Exposing the skin directly to the sun increased sweat evaporation, causing the body to lose water rapidly. Egyptians avoided this by wearing loose, lightweight linen clothing that covered their skin while allowing airflow. Unlike modern fabrics, linen is naturally breathable and absorbs sweat, helping to cool the body as the moisture evaporates slowly. Many travellers also wrapped their heads in cloth headdresses or turbans, shielding themselves from the relentless sun. This practice was common among traders, soldiers, and messengers, who frequently moved between Memphis, Thebes, and the Red Sea ports. Without head coverings, intense sun exposure could lead to heat exhaustion and increased water loss, making dehydration a bigger threat. Some Egyptian tomb paintings and carvings depict desert travellers with draped head coverings, emphasising the importance of sun protection. The famous Medjay warriors, who patrolled the deserts and protected trade routes, were often shown wearing white linen wraps and full-body coverings to endure the extreme heat. Beyond clothing, Egyptians also soaked their garments in water before travelling, using evaporation to stay cool longer. This technique was used by labourers working on pyramids and even soldiers marching through desert regions. Egyptians understood that survival in the desert wasn't just about drinking water, it was about preventing unnecessary water loss. Wearing protective clothing and head coverings allowed them to travel longer distances without depleting their limited water supply. Even with smart clothing choices, Egyptians had to be resourceful, constantly finding ways to stretch their water supply while navigating the vast, unforgiving desert, training the body for desert travel. Carrying water alone wasn't a guarantee to survive the Egyptian desert. Conditioning the body to withstand extreme conditions was equally important. Ancient Egyptians, especially traders, soldiers and nomads, understood that physical preparation was key to travelling for days with limited water. Through training, discipline and adaptation, they were able to reduce their need for water and endure the relentless desert heat. One of the most effective methods was gradual dehydration training. Instead of always drinking whenever they felt thirsty, Egyptian desert travellers trained their bodies to retain fluids for longer periods. By reducing their water intake over time, their bodies adapted to using water more efficiently, delaying dehydration. Long-distance traders moving between Thebes and Nubia, or military forces marching through the Sinai Peninsula, relied on this technique to survive multi-day journeys. Egyptians also developed techniques to minimize sweat loss, which was just as important as drinking water. Controlled sweating was a key survival method. Desert travelers walked at a slow, steady pace, avoiding sudden bursts of movement that would increase perspiration. They also breathed through their noses instead of their mouths, which helped trap moisture in their bodies. Some Egyptian desert scouts and royal messengers were trained for years before being trusted with solo desert missions. They were taught how to withstand hours without water, locate shade, and identify the best times to move. Records suggest that Pharaoh Thutmose III's military forces included specially trained soldiers who could march through the desert for extended periods without constant access to water. Before setting off on long journeys, Egyptians adjusted their diets to help their bodies store moisture. Foods like dates, melons and figs were common because they contained high water content. Some travellers even bathed before their trips, cooling their skin to delay sweating once they entered the desert heat. Even with the best preparation, desert travel was always dangerous. Egyptians combined physical endurance, strategic planning and survival techniques to push their limit, proving that survival in the desert was just as much about discipline as it was about water.